At 5 o'clock every morning, while most of the town was still buried beneath blankets, Thomas was usually still awake. He was 32 years old, and for most of his adult life, he had felt as though he were running on a road that led nowhere. Every evening at 8, he reported for work as a security guard at a large warehouse on the edge of town. He spent the night walking through dark corridors, checking locked doors, watching trucks come and go, and listening to the slow ticking of the clock. At 6 in the morning, his shift ended, and while the rest of the town was beginning its day, Thomas was going home to sleep. He earned just enough money to survive. His apartment was a tiny room with a mattress on the floor. The fan had stopped working months ago. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering whenever the electricity became unstable. His shoes were worn through at the soles, and several of his shirts had been washed so many times that the fabric had become thin. But poverty was not what hurt Thomas the most. It was the feeling that his life was standing still. Every morning, on his walk home from work, he passed houses where families were sitting down for breakfast. He saw parents preparing their children for school. He saw men and women leaving for offices, wearing clean clothes and carrying briefcases. He would watch them through their windows and quietly ask himself, when will that be my life? He had tried to change. He had applied for better jobs, but he had only finished high school. Employers wanted degrees, certificates, experience, things Thomas did not have. He thought about learning a new skill, but exhaustion always defeated him. After working all night, he had barely enough energy to eat and fall onto his mattress. So another day passed, then another, then another. His mother called him every Sunday from their village. One evening she asked him, as she always did, "Thomas, when will things get better for you?" Thomas forced a laugh. "Soon, Mama. I'm working on it." But the truth was painful. He wasn't working on it. He didn't know how. Thomas was not lazy. He worked every night. He walked miles. He stayed awake when he was exhausted. He did everything his job demanded of him. But hard work alone wasn't changing his life. He was working hard just to remain exactly where he was. And that frightened him. He began to wonder whether this was how his entire life would look. Night shifts, a small apartment, an empty bank account, and the constant feeling that his real life was happening somewhere else. Then, one Tuesday morning in November, everything changed. Thomas had just finished his shift when his phone rang. It was his sister. Her voice was trembling. "Thomas, you need to come home." "What happened?" "It's Mama." Thomas stopped walking. "What's wrong with her?" "She collapsed. She's in the hospital." For a few seconds, Thomas couldn't speak. Then he turned around and headed straight for the bus station. The journey to his village normally took 3 hours. That morning, it felt like an entire lifetime. When he finally arrived, he found his mother lying in a small hospital bed. She looked smaller than he remembered. Her face was tired. Her hands were thin. For years, those hands had worked in the fields, cooked meals, carried heavy loads, and raised her children. Now they barely had the strength to hold his. The doctor explained that she had collapsed because of exhaustion, poor nutrition, and stress. She needed medicine. She needed rest. She needed proper food. Things Thomas knew his family could barely afford. He sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then his mother opened her eyes. "Thomas, I'm here, Mama." She squeezed his hand. "My son, don't waste your life." Thomas looked at her. She continued softly, "I spent my whole life surviving. I don't want you to spend yours doing the same thing." Thomas felt something break inside him. Not his heart. Something deeper. The part of him that had accepted his circumstances as permanent. His mother closed her eyes. Thomas remained beside her until she fell asleep. Then he walked outside. It was still dark. The clock showed 5 a.m. The village was silent. A few farmers were already walking toward their fields. Birds were beginning to sing. The air was cold against his face. Thomas stood there alone. And for the first time in years, he stopped asking, "Why is my life like this?" Instead, he asked, "What am I going to do about it?" He looked toward the horizon. Then he whispered, "No more. I don't know how yet, but I will find a way." On the journey back to town, Thomas sat quietly by the window. Then he noticed the man sitting across from him. The man was in his 50s, dressed neatly, carrying a book. Thomas recognized him. It was Mr. Chun, one of the most successful businessmen in town. Thomas couldn't understand what he was doing on such an early bus. Finally, he gathered the courage to ask, "Excuse me, sir. Can I ask you something?" Mr. Chun looked up. "Of course. Why are you traveling this early?" Mr. Chun smiled. Because this is my favorite time of day. Why? I wake up early. Before the phones start ringing. Before people begin asking me for things. Before the world becomes noisy. He held up his book. I read. I think. I plan. Thomas looked down. I wish I had time to do things like that. Mr. Chun studied him. You work nights, don't you? Thomas nodded. Security guard. And when do you sleep? During the day. Mr. Chun was silent for a moment. Then he said something Thomas would never forget. Then perhaps your problem isn't that you don't have enough time. Thomas looked at him. Perhaps you've never learned how to use the time you have. Those words stayed with Thomas. Mr. Chun explained that years earlier, he had made a simple rule for himself. Before the world demanded something from him, he would spend time building himself. Give yourself 2 hours, he said. 2 hours every day. 1 hour to learn something that can change your income. 1 hour to strengthen your body and your mind. Thomas hesitated. But I'm exhausted. I know. Then how can I do it? Mr. Chun smiled. That's why it will matter. Before they reached Thomas's stop, Mr. Chun wrote his phone number on a small piece of paper. If you're serious, call me. Thomas looked at the number. What happens if I fail? Mr. Chun smiled. Then you wake up the next morning and try again. The next morning, Thomas set his alarm for 5 o'clock. When it rang, he hated everything about the sound. His body was exhausted. His eyes burned. His mind immediately offered him an excuse. Sleep for another hour. You worked all night. You can start tomorrow. Thomas almost listened. Then he remembered his mother's hands. He remembered her words. Don't waste your life. He got out of bed. That was the first victory. Not a promotion. Not money. Not success. Just getting out of bed. He sat at a small table and opened his phone. He had decided to learn accounting and Excel because businesses needed those skills. For 1 hour, he studied. He didn't understand much. He made mistakes. He replayed the same lessons over and over. But he continued. At 6, he put on his worn shoes and walked. 30 minutes. Every morning. The first week was miserable. His body protested. His mind complained. Some mornings he stared at the screen without understanding a single word. But he kept showing up. Nobody applauded him. Nobody knew what he was doing. There was no audience. No reward. Only Thomas and the promise he had made to himself. Around the 20th day, something strange happened. Thomas woke up before his alarm. 4:58 a.m. He sat on the edge of his mattress. For the first time, he wasn't angry about being awake. He was ready. The lessons that had once seemed impossible were beginning to make sense. Excel formulas became familiar. Numbers stopped looking like meaningless symbols. He completed his first online certificate. Then another. Then another. His morning walks became something he looked forward to. He began noticing things he had never noticed before. The sunrise, the quiet streets, the cool morning air. But the biggest change wasn't happening outside him. It was happening inside him. Thomas began to trust himself again. He had spent years believing that he was powerless. Now he had evidence that he could make a promise to himself and keep it. 2 hours at a time. 1 morning at a time. 1 day at a time. By the 3rd month, Thomas had learned enough to do something useful. His warehouse struggled with inventory management. So Thomas created an Excel system to organize the stock. He worked on it during his early mornings. Then one day, he showed it to his supervisor. His supervisor stared at the spreadsheet. Thomas, where did you learn this? Thomas smiled. I taught myself. How? Thomas paused. I wake up early. Word spread. The warehouse manager saw his work. Then the owner saw it. And on the 87th day of Thomas's new life, his supervisor called him into the office. Thomas, we're expanding the accounting department. Thomas stood silently. We need someone who understands the warehouse and has basic bookkeeping skills. The supervisor pushed a document across the desk. We'd like you to take the position. Thomas stared at the paper. It was a daytime job, an office position, and the salary was twice what he had been earning. For a moment, he couldn't speak. 3 months earlier, he had been walking home from a night shift wondering whether his life would ever change. Now he was being offered a completely different future. When do I start? He finally asked. Monday. Thomas walked out of the office. He stood outside for several minutes. Then he called his mother. She answered. Hello, my son. Thomas smiled. Mama. Yes. I think my life is finally changing. There was silence on the other end. Then he heard her laugh softly. I knew you could do it. A year later, Thomas was no longer the same man. He had become the company's lead accountant. He had saved enough money to move his mother closer to him. She received better medical care. He rented a comfortable apartment. He bought his first proper pair of shoes in years. But there was one thing he never changed. Every morning, at 5 o'clock, Thomas woke up. Not because someone ordered him to. Not because he was afraid of losing his job. Not because Mr. Chun was watching. He woke up because he had discovered something more valuable than an early morning. He had discovered that his future was built from the choices he made when nobody was watching. Those 2 quiet hours belonged to him. Sometimes he studied. Sometimes he exercised. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he simply sat by the window and planned his next step. One morning, a coworker asked him, "Thomas, why do you still wake up at 5? You've already succeeded." Thomas smiled. "No." The coworker looked confused. Thomas continued, "I didn't wake up early because I wanted to become successful. I became successful because I learned to show up for my future every day." Then he looked toward the sunrise. Success isn't a destination. It's a daily practice. Thomas's story isn't really about 5 o'clock in the morning. It's about a decision. For years, Thomas waited for his circumstances to change. He waited for a better job. He waited for more money. He waited for an opportunity. He waited until he had enough energy. And nothing changed. Then one morning, he stopped waiting. He didn't suddenly become smarter. He didn't receive an inheritance. He didn't meet someone who handed him a perfect life. He simply decided that the person responsible for his future was himself. His first victory was getting out of bed. His second was learning. His third was refusing to quit. And eventually, those small victories became a completely different life. The lesson is simple. You don't always need a miracle. Sometimes you need a decision followed by thousands of small actions. Your life may not change tomorrow. You may not receive a promotion in 90 days. You may not become rich. But if you spend 90 days becoming stronger, learning a valuable skill, taking care of your body, and keeping promises to yourself, you will not be the same person you are today. Thomas didn't change his entire life in one morning. He changed the direction of his life in one morning. And then he kept walking. One morning, one choice, 1 hour, one day at a time. Because sometimes the most important moment of your life doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, at 5 a.m., when the world is still asleep, when nobody is watching, and you have to decide whether you will press snooze or finally get up and meet the person you could become.